Hope you enjoyed her. Well, let's check in about sin, your readings, the video, what you brought today. And if you want to go back the last 2 weeks, if there's anything dangling, that's okay too, because I missed your lovely discussion.
One of the things that got my attention, because I had never thought about it that way before, was in this book, was that when we sin normally, at least I do, you know, I focus on myself. But when we sin, it affects others. And, you know, it either makes their lives, you know, it causes hurt, it causes distress, it causes disappointment, causes people not to feel that good about themselves, even though they weren't the ones who did it, and so forth. So by seeing the social aspect of that was really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to parrot that. I thought that in the video that she offered, that she did a really good job drawing out how we've sort of individualized this and how we tend to think of decisions like, well, if I'm not hurting anybody, it must be okay. And then there's this other context for like, but is it growing? Is it growing life for other people?
I was really identified with my father was the son of a minister, a Baptist minister, and which unfortunately he died before I was born. But my father was an alcoholic, and he could never get over the fact that he felt that he had failed. Mm. And I saw the month before he died, I went up there every weekend, and I feel bad that I somehow never convinced him that he didn't fail.
He failed his father, his faith, or what? Just in general,
his idea of who he was, what God meant for him to be. Because I know the last time I visited him, he said because somehow the near-death experiences have been in, and he said, I don't want to meet God, because you know, and so that's what I was trying to convince him that wasn't my idea.
Hmm. Yeah.
I have never, and I'm sure I got this from what I think the Catholic Church says, okay? But since I'm not a Catholic, I can't know for sure, but I've always thought that the concept of original sin was just wrong, because babies are not born with sin.
Susan, I wrote no.
You know,
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
so, but then I came to realize that it means, at least this is what I think it means. It means that we as human beings, we are born with the capacity for sin. Mm-hmm. Because of sin in the garden. And so Adam and Eve, as sinless, was destroyed. And we are all descendants of Adam and Eve. Therefore, you know, our sinlessness was destroyed, and we have the capacity for sin. That's what I've come to realize, what original sin maybe is. I'm asking.
Well, you know, there was that concept wasn't available until, that I'm aware of, until Augustine of Hippo. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, I call it his invention, but maybe he meant it more like you're saying it, but it hasn't been passed down that way to us.
Yeah.
It's interesting because that's kind of what she alluded to in the video, this idea that you may not be born a sinner, but you're born into a society that's tinged with the vestiges of sin. Yeah. So you may not be born a sinner, but you're born into sin.
In that sense, yes.
Yeah. The community that you're born into.
Yeah, and if you ever read Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile, it's about a boy who essentially grows up away from society was up on an island and he grows up virtuous and perfect because there was no human beings to like steep him in sin. Do you know this?
No,
Rousseau?
That's what, yeah.
So the three big ones were Rousseau, Hobbes, and Locke. Hobbes says people are born bad. That's the Leviathan. Locke says we're tabula rasa, like we're born a blank slate. And Rousseau says we're born good, but we're systematized into ways that are like not healthy. And in some ways, they all approach the argument differently. And to think about what Augustine meant when he talked about Adam's sperm literally shriveling, because he did, right? That Adam's sperm shriveled because of the sin. There was an ontological change in the human being. This is where the Immaculate Conception of Mary comes from, is that her father's sperm was regenerated so that Mary wasn't born an original sinner. That's the miracle of the Immaculate Conception. Who knows if he was talking about society or just inherent ontology? But I think most of us in the Western tradition have unfortunately swallowed the idea that there's something inherently wrong with human beings.
And I know
As a
the
result.
Roman Church drilled it into us.
Well, that's part of why I mean, if you don't mind me saying this is part of the reason why our Catholic brothers and sisters tend to be very vociferously anti-abortion, because that would send the child to hell. Since they're in a state of original sin, if they're not baptized, they'll go to hell.
Oh, that's awful.
So what about babies that are born and die before they're baptized?
Well, I'm not Roman, and I'm not saying all Romans believe this. I'm just talking about like what the sort of the doctrinal layers
The
are.
doctrine is.
What do I think about it? Geez.
Yeah,
So I was thinking about this reading. What is the sin in the garden?
They disobeyed God.
Man, I wasn't trying to bait you, but you said that. And I've really been thinking hard about that. Is obedience the biggest virtue in life?
Obedience to God.
Well, why did they want to eat that fruit?
To be more like God.
Shoot, I thought that was the whole point of this.
because it was the tree of knowledge.
And the woman said it'd be nice to be like God.
Right.
Wouldn't it be nice to be more godly?
Yeah.
So where's the limit?
Yeah,
Yeah, another interesting, in line with this, another interesting side is that Adam and Eve had no experience about what sin was even like, to have knowledge to avoid it. They didn't know, but I mean, God had not been mean to them or anything of that sort.
and the snake was God's creature.
And told them the truth. You'll be like God, you'll know stuff. You won't die the day you eat it. And that didn't happen.
Well, you know, another thing that's interesting about that story is that that story was not created by the writers of the Bible. That story had been around for millennia, traveling through the various cultures and civilizations that existed prior to the time where the scriptures were written. And they had all kinds of different understandings of it. So, but we have what is the Roman understanding of it, and it's damaging.
Yeah, I think the story is very damaging.
Mhm.
I think the story is very damaging, taken at the simplest literal form.
Yeah.
And
In so many ways,
yes,
individually and societal.
and
I think it's theologically dangerous.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, you know, it's.
Story,
it's just a story.
I mean. Who wrote Genesis?
No, Nobody knows.
Who created this? You know,
I,
I've
you,
always wondered.
yeah, it would be
like,
lovely
you
to find
read
out, wouldn't it?
Genesis, and if you believe everything literally in the Bible, you believe it. But if you really think about it, who, who, we don't know how we got here. We know how we think we got here. God created us.
So I want to offer that if we hold the story lightly, it offers some interesting insight into what I think of as like typical human behavior. Let me give you an example. Susan, you won't believe what happened last night. I was talking to Ellen and I shouldn't tell you this, sorry. You're gonna say, well, no, you have to tell me. Because we'd rather have knowledge than life. I think the story says, sometimes we'll be curious to our detriment. Sometimes we will follow knowledge, even though we know there's no life in it, because we just want to have it. I think that's kind of human. I don't want to talk about human nature, because it's not bad, it's not evil, but it's descriptive, right?
It is.
I was just thinking, every people in all the world, no matter how primitive, has a creation story. So, because that's the human way to try to make sense of where you find yourself.
And the stories don't always, they're not, I don't think they're really trying to tell you how do we come about. I think they're really trying to say like, what's essential to humanity and how do we kind of relate to God? I mean, the stories really, I think, rather than being like textbook, are trying to say like, what's our place? What's our place? So,
and cultures that have creation stories that are more centered around animals than ours is, they seem to have a closer bond with animal world because they feel they come from that world, or that world influences them, the animals.
And that world influences their stories.
Yes,
Yeah, what we live in influences our interpretation of everything we experience. Or helps us explain what we haven't experienced and wondered about.
yeah, and I think it's fair to say, I was talking with my friend last week about this, how in some ways we're pretty unique historically in that we don't have like a strong sense of place in contemporary America. You think if you're Jewish, there's like the Holy Land, and that's Jerusalem, and that's where you go, right? And long time ago in Europe, you had like the family inheritance, that was the plot that you farmed, and your identity was made up of this place. So what places do we have now that we place ourselves? Like if I asked you, not just where's home, but like, where is your place? I don't think we get to the same kind of answers that people would have had 200 years ago, because we're very nomadic, right? But we're mobile. And even when we talk about sacred places, people might say Jerusalem is this or that, or people might say, oh, like I go to my church, but not quite like people would have done in the ancient world, right? And so I think we're kind of in some ways without some anchors that people have enjoyed for a long time. That's not right or wrong, it's just sort of descriptive, right? And then when you think about where our anchors are or where they are not, in terms of like places and people, animals certainly would have been part of a place, as would have been species of plants. But you know, if you go to the grocery, do most of you think like, is it asparagus season? I mean, it's there. If you want it, you buy it, right? I mean, globalized groceries have gone nuts, right? You can buy anything you want anytime. And 50 years ago, that wasn't even possible, right? It was not possible. Even when I was in high school, if I wanted particular ethnic foods, I had to go to those countries, but now you can get anything you want anytime, right? And so in some ways, like places are all mixed up. What does it have to do with sin? I just think it has a lot to do with identity. And I do wonder about, you know, our relationship to the world in relationship to like our little bit of identity confusion. Nobody wants me to say that the inhumane treatment of animals is sinful, but it is,
Right, yeah.
and our entire economy is based on it. So there, you go to the grocery and you buy meat, you're part of that system, right? Hey, and I don't know that I can completely be outside of it. I mean, I don't eat animal products except I eat fish, and that's kind of dreadful too, right? Like the oceans are being overfished. Like this is pretty clear.
Yeah.
What the real question is like, what do we do? Not like I can fix the system, but I think this is part of like this bigger sense of sin as being systemic. And sometimes I think we settle down to like, oh, you told your teacher a lie, that's a sin, it's terrible, and we forget that there's like this bigger thing that God is like more concerned about. Me not lying to my teacher, I can fix that. The global food supply, I can't fix that. Which gives it a capital S, I think. Sin with a capital S is that.
And it talks about systemic sin in here.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it quite so globally, but I certainly see that.
Yeah. And you know, the whole world is in a place where nothing is stable hardly anymore. You know, we have immigrants that are desperate. I mean, it's just like most people don't have a place to really call home because they're always moving, or they need to move, or have to move. Yeah, so it's hard when you're born into a system like that because there is a lot of sin.
Well, I think when we have like identity confusion, we have to shuffle the whole deck of cards, right? I mean, and I don't, I just tell you, I get wanderlust. I mean, home is where I've been for 3 days. Is kind of how my brain works. I'm serious. Like and we grew up in the same house for a long time, but for some reason, I don't feel like my home's in Florida, and here's my home, I guess, but I was in Utah 3 nights on the trail. I started to think this is where I live. Like I just, like I spent a couple nights somewhere and I start to, feel like this is where I am, and it's neither bad. All I want to say is it informs, I think, some of the ways in which we have to think about this. But I would encourage us to think a little bit harder. I'm not trying to just be provocative. Is disobedience the biggest deal we got going today?
Say that again.
Is disobedience the biggest problem in the world?
If we think about, they were saying sin is, what is morally wrong. If we take the concept that God gave us rules, God gave us morals, God set our standards, then when we break any of those standards or any of those rules, we would be sinning against God. So the long view of that, I could go with.
I'm really struggling with what you said, Adam and Eve and disobedience. Yeah, I think that in their innocence, they were like God. And they lost that innocence when they chose freedom to make a choice that then opened their eyes to things other than what God intended. Does that make sense?
But then
I'm not so sure that they disobeyed. He gave us freedom and hoped that we would use that freedom to love him more. And I think by saying, I don't want you to eat that apple because it's going to make you start looking at yourself as the most important thing, rather than this paradise and each other that I've created. And instead of having that nurturing, loving relationship with God, once they ate of the forbidden fruit, they turned inward.
Mm.
And they started thinking of themselves.
That's a good point.
That is a good point.
And that's why they covered themselves
And
up.
that's why they covered
Mhm.
themselves. So they were living
Yeah,
godlike in their innocence and their paradise and their joy and their love for each other. And using their free will is what caused them to, they call it sin, but it caused them to turn inward and make themselves more important than God.
the line you said about turning inward's interesting to me, because the first thing that they get with their knowledge is that they're naked,
Right.
and then they're ashamed,
Yeah.
and that is an inward turn.
Mhm.
There's something wrong with me.
Right.
Shame is there's something wrong with me.
And all of a sudden, I'm the priority here.
In a priority in a different way, not I'm the most important,
Mhm.
I'm flawed.
Right, they recognize that. And that's not what God intended.
So it's this interesting thing, isn't it, when you think about modesty, how we teach modesty shamefully to our children. Think back when you learned about modesty. Was that a shame-free experience for you?
Mm-hmm.
Mine was steeped in shame, like you do not show these parts, right?
Yeah.
The shame, we even use that word, shame on you. Now, I can tell you when my daughter went down to my mom's, she usually immediately ripped that diaper off and ran around wild. And I don't think my mother shamed her, because until a couple of years ago, she'd come home and that's what she would do. She would just get down into her underwear as soon as she walked in the door. And I was scratching my head, but because we never told her not to,
Yeah.
it was natural for her. And she picked up that when you go out of the house, you put clothes on, and she got that. Nothing wrong with that. But it is interesting to think that knowledge brought shame to the human being.
Yeah.
If you're interested in knowing, the rabbis have this really high view of marriage. They say marriage happens when two people are naked and unashamed. And they don't just mean physically, obviously, right? They mean like you're able to sort of bear your soul with another human
Right.
being and have that cradled instead of agitated. A high view of marriage. But I think the inward turn is helpful to think about how we can turn inward, and maybe part of the return, repentance means to return actually, is to be mindful that there's other folk.
Yeah.
I had a thought and it's just wrong.
That happens to me all
But
the
it,
time.
but it had to do with if only there in if the inward stuff had recognized the importance of the rest of the world and not just the South.
Would you say that again, please?
I'm not that it only turning inward had made them realize that the rest of the world was more important.
The
outward. The outward,
Yeah.
yeah. But I think that's what I was thinking.
And to me, I don't think of disobedience as being to God as being the greatest sin. I think it's kind of what Jan said, is the lack of care and concern for others. Either others that we know or others that we don't know. If we have that lack of compassion, empathy for other people, I think that's a greater sin.
definitely not loving others.
Well, and I think this is where, like, my little psychological dabbling that I've done, it's just a good reminder that you can't give what you don't have. And so if we don't take care of ourselves, we can't take care of anybody else.
We as women are very good about taking care of other people and being aware of their needs. We're horrible about taking care of ourselves and our needs. Just throw that out there.
Do you think that's changing?
Yes,
With society
we're
and the
working on it.
culture?
We're
Yeah.
working on it.
Yeah, we are.
We've got a long way to go, but we're working.
We're
You're right.
aware of it.
Yeah. And it's easier for me to help other people do that than it is for me to do it myself. You know, I'm just owning that. It is hard.
Self-care is really hard, and I think that some of the strongest advocates for self-care I find to be very selfish. I'm serious, because
Yeah.
it's hard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and where's that line?
There always seems to be a
That
line, right?
balance.
I mean, like, if you think about other people, and you're concerned about taking care of other people, well, you have to live a relatively healthy lifestyle, otherwise you're gonna be a burden on them, right? I mean, if we don't take care of the bodies we have, that's gonna be burdensome to other people down the road. So I do think it's pretty tricky.
It is.
And I did have someone, this was very revealing to me, tell me at one point in time, because I consider myself a very strong, independent person. I can take care of things, right? That if you do not allow others to help you, you deny them that opportunity to give kindness and love. If you're always saying, I'm fine, you know, even if you're not. But again, kind of like what Darlene said, we as women don't like to show that vulnerability to others. We're the strong ones. You know, it's the men that are bad patients, you know, that kind of thing. But I do think that vulnerability with others certainly has a place.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce a couple other ideas you've probably heard. So I think C.S. Lewis defines the nature of sin as pride. Pride. I've heard sin described as we say this, trespass. So stepping on something that's not yours. Of course, there's this idea of sin as a stain, like a blot in a garment. And removing a stain is pretty difficult, right? Of course, we have like moral transgression is an idea. You know, she mentioned in the video missing the mark. That's actually only half of the term in Hebrew. The other half is a weight. So it's a burden that you carry.
You know, it's funny, but in Australia where we lived, missing the mark, if that came on your report card, if that came up as an adult, that was considered the sin.
Oh,
They just, if I never knew what it was supposed to be, but it would come up missing the mark, you know.
A mark?
That was like.
Yeah, okay,
Like there's a standard. If
yes,
you missed it.
yes. Wow.
yeah.
The kids went to Anglican schools,
Mhm.
and that's where I heard that, yeah, quite a bit. Like on report cards.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's an archery term in Hebrew, missing the mark. And of course, if you stop shooting, that wouldn't be helpful either. Like your goal is to like just improve your aim. I want you to hear the weight though. So when you hear Jesus say, "Come unto me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Come all of you who are full of sin.
Yeah.
And I'll lift it off you." In Greek, the word is like it's a dramatic word. You probably read Oedipus Rex when you were in high school, and you heard about he has hubris. That's his tragic flaw. He's trying to be more than he is. The word sin in Greek is tragic flaw, Oedipus's kind was hubris, although not everybody has hubris. So your tragic flaw could be you give to a fault. And you give everything away and there's nothing left for you, and that would be sinful. Or your tragic flaw could be that you always are expecting the worst case scenario. And many times you could be right. And your tragic flaw could be that you always expect the worst, and so you never trust somebody else. You see how this goes? So I'm giving you these just to give you a little more nuance, because I think if we bundle this around like a moral code, we've missed a lot. And as I've mentioned to you in the past, I'm not sure. I mean, there are days where I'll settle for obedience from my kid, but I would much rather have their honor than their obedience. I mean, I don't want them to do what I want them to do. Not really when I'm in my right head. I want them to have fulfilled, happy lives. And I would like to be honored by them. Sometimes there are things I'd like them to obey, but the honor is more important to me than the obedience. Does that make sense?
You brought this up several times. I find it interesting that this perplexes you a little bit.
I'm chewing on it. Yeah.
What do you, explain to me, honor? And
It's
what-
hard to explain honor, isn't it? I mean, okay, so I can just give you a story, right? Like, honor your father and mother so that your days will be long and you'll dwell in the land. This is like the first commandment with a promise. So if you were to bring somebody home and say, this is the person I intend to marry, and your parents told you you should not marry this person, do you choose to honor them or do you choose to obey them? Because those could have very different outcomes.
so are
Obeying
you
means,
saying in that case, honor is obey?
oh no, I'm saying not. I'm saying I can honor my parents by disobeying them.
But could honor be, is having a deep respect?
I hope so.
I think of it as respect and
Mhm.
love, not obedience.
And using the formation and care that they gave you to make decisions, right? Or maybe it is that you have them very much in the mental room of your decision making as conversation partners, but you might make a specifically different choice.
Well, more like, thank you for your input. I honor the thoughtfulness that comes with it. You know,
Thank you
and I
for
will
hearing
take that
enough
into
to tell me.
consideration.
This
Then
is a
do we
child
I mean,
speaking.
I think, to be honest, I think like when we think about prayer, a lot of prayer, is prayer meant to be like an obedience regimen, or is it meant to be about honor? So,
How about both?
well, I don't know that it is always both. When I roll up to the salad bar at Ruby Tuesday and I ask God what toppings to put on the salad, does God really care? No and yes. No and yes, right? Like, don't drink a pint of salad dressing, Mike, because like your life will be diminished. And I care about that. So use that more sparingly. But like, I don't think there'll be a special revelation about how many chickpeas go on top of the arugula. But if I have an awareness, right, about life and joy and honor in my head, hopefully that prevents me from drinking the pint of salad dressing that I have no business drinking.
Well, somewhere I read, and many people here are talking about that today, Darlene talked about self-care, but they talked in here about an act can be a good act, but if it exceeds a boundary, it could be sinful. And I think that boundary between obedience and honor changes if you brought up a child, because I know this as a child ages. And you don't expect honor from the beginning,
Right.
because you haven't earlier, they don't understand it, but you do sort of expect obedience. But when they become adults, I don't expect obedience anymore. You hope honor has kicked in.
You hope for that. Yeah, I think you said it well, right? And I think sometimes The reason I think I've mentioned this a few times, Herb, is because I think in my own spiritual journey, what I've felt was that, or the thoughts that I've had is that we got stuck on obedience as the highest form of relationship with God.
Mm,
And I think that might be to our detriment.
mm.
I think God is frankly more interested in our honor than our obedience. I think that now.
Well, you know, to me, a relationship with God is precisely that. In other words, I've read many times that, you know, we're in partnership with God. We have our gifts and abilities, but that God honors those. But the thing is, that's important in our relationship with God is the love that's there. Love exceeds all else, and because when you love somebody, your actions become good most of the time, I guess say. And so God is not, and I think in our upbringing, regardless of what religious background, what version of Catholicism we had, was that it was all up here in our heads. And I think that I wonder today, you know, if if maybe more Christians are living more from their head than from their heart. Loving God is a feeling thing. It's not something that it's just up here where it's cold. But the thing is this, we were never taught how to get the love of God into our hearts, because loving God is just like loving a friend or loving someone you love very deeply. And God returns that. There are times when you can feel God's love for you. You know, there are things that you do something good for somebody else and you get this feeling of really good. Well, that's God saying, yeah, you know, I like that. But God, in your prayer time, can come and just wrap you in love, and you can feel that. But you have to get it from here to here, that God is a living, feeling being. We have made him a judge, a very judgmental, but God is really a lover and wants your cooperation, wants you to talk with God about things. And, you know, might not get an answer right away, but it'll come, you know, at the right time. You know, it's just being open to that. So then you are more careful about sin and avoiding sin, because you get to know this God more, and you don't want anything to alienate that. So you want to be faithful.
I do think you've mentioned it, like I think a really helpful point, which is God as the prosecuting attorney, which is a very, very legalistic image, right? And that actually came from several of the church fathers who, what do you know, were attorneys. So they envisioned God as a judge with a gavel, right?
But that's not it.
Well, I mean, I don't know that any singular image is wrong, but I don't think any singular image stands on its own, right? I mean, I think injustice is not okay.
But yeah,
And that can't be it, right? So I think this is what's hard, right? Is that we kind of, and C.S. Lewis does describe this pretty well, we kind of bounce from one image to another when we do this. Actually, well, we bounce from one to the other because no single image can really contain the whole model for this, right? I do hope you hear, though, that from my perspective, it's really helpful to hear about sin as a weight, because sometimes I get weighted down with stuff I didn't deserve or I didn't ask for. And that's very real,
yeah.
right? Particularly when you think about, and hear this right, if sin is a weight or a burden, there's a lot of sinful children out there because they've been beat up by their parents.
Yeah.
And that sin that they carry that they didn't deserve, but is very spiritual and real and heavy.
And if they can get to know God, and they can work through that. They can work out of it. They can become whole people, but we don't have people teaching them how to do that.
Well, and I think that's an interesting approach too. I actually, the research says that some kids will never come out from underneath that.
That's right, yeah.
And so I don't know if it's just teaching, and I do think part of that harkens back to what we heard in the reading in the video about social stigma and social sin as well, right? I mean, I don't know what the average kid thinks about somebody who's in foster care. I don't know. I know usually when I hear somebody's in foster care, this part of my brain usually thinks, well, what went wrong? Like, why? Instead of like, oh, that's like a normal thing that happens, and Johnny's just a normal kid. This is like a why question comes up in your head, which could result in you treating that person differently, right? And I don't say that that's morally wrong, because it's just a thing we do, but it sure is a weight, right? It's a weight. Even when we have that thought, it weights the way that we interact with other people when we've got this information. And I would say as a parent too, right? Like there's things there's parenting decisions I've made that were not morally right or wrong. They were just choices, but I still sometimes have regret or what ifs. And that regret or what if is a weight, because you're holding space for that. And how do you untether from that? That's really, when we talk about repentance and reconciliation, that's kind of what those things are for. But I do think it's important to define sin pretty broadly, if you don't mind, because there's a lot of pieces. We got to read Paul Tillich says that, and this is something that Kay kind of said. Tillich said that sin is when we turn away from God towards ourselves. And I like Migliore's thought that is an opposition to grace. I like that one the best, if you don't mind me saying. Not like I hate grace, but it could be I'm opposed because I don't think I need it, or I don't think I deserve it, or I'm not worth it, or it would cost you too much to give it. There's lots of reasons we could be opposed to grace. Not just that we hate it, but there could be some sense of shame. And that's where I think the garden story is really interesting, to think that shame is one of those things that gets out of control for us.
What is your definition of grace?
Oh, man.
Yeah.
That's next week's topic. It's a great question. I'm gonna wait till next week, not just to be naughty, but because I'm just gonna wait.
Yeah. And it is next
Because
week.
it's confusing.
It's pretty confusing.
You hear a lot of different definitions for grace.
Yeah.
In the religion world.
I think there is also, it's important to think like, when we think about what some of these metaphors or analogies we use, what they do, like I heard the term wholeness used just a second ago. I might have even used it, like somebody's not whole. Like, does sin like punch holes in us? Are we broken people, or do we have brokenness? Those seem like different things to me, right? Are we victims, or have we all been differently victimized? Those are different things, right?
Absolutely.
And I do think like there's an understanding of sin that says like, this is perfection, and because there's some sin in your life, here you are. So you're not whole, you're incomplete, you're whatever, and that can take you down this really quick part to where we ended up in the 28 prayer book. There is no good in us.
Yeah.
And this is what I want to say about liturgy too. Sometimes the liturgy does a really good job at bringing out how we feel, but our feelings aren't true.
Example.
Well, and I'm going to take issue with this reading. Against you alone, Lord, have I sinned. Well, you raped a woman and you killed her husband. I think you sinned against them.
Yeah.
Now, you might feel like you've only bothered God, but you killed another human being.
And brought pain and suffering to their family.
Sometimes we feel like God doesn't love us, but that ain't true. I hope you hear that. Well, at least I don't think it's true. I sure feel it. I feel it as if it were the truth, but it isn't true. Liturgy does that a lot.
Yeah.
The Psalms do that a lot.
Yes.
So we can either read the Psalms as telling us how it is, or we can hear the Psalms saying like, oh my God, I felt like that my whole life. But it isn't true.
I have trouble with the concept of missing the mark, because to me, that sets up what I've felt a lot of my life. If I'm not perfect, if I don't reach the goal, then I'm worthless. I have no value. My value is only if I get there, if I hit the mark. So the courage to be imperfect
Yeah.
is really important.
And I think there's a lot wrapped up in that. When I ask kids, what's the point of the game Monopoly? You know what they'll tell you.
Get the most money.
Get the most money,
And
bankrupt your opponents. Do you know the point of the game Monopoly? To have fun. We think about missing the mark as winning instead of as recreation. And that's where I think I missed the mark about missing the mark.
Yes.
You could make it about perfection, but you could just as well make it about recreation.
It's like the story I told when we had dinner, the school dinner at your house. We were talking about playing games, and I don't like to play games. Richard and I, when we first got together, we were playing Scrabble. And I was kind of playing for the fun of it, and he was playing to win. By golly. And by golly, he did win every blankety blank time. My solution was to throw away the Scrabble game because it didn't feel good
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah.
It wasn't fun.
And I think that actually is a pretty good match for what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, So
And so
sometimes-
therefore I missed out on playing for fun.
yes.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm denying myself the fun of playing games. But it's not fun for me.
And,
I don't
and I,
win.
and I would say that is a pretty big consequence of sin is competition.
Yeah.
Competition instead of camaraderie. It's one thing when I have a friend and we're racing together and we're encouraging each other and making each other better, like that's great. But when I have to beat my friend or we can't be friends anymore, it just sort of says we weren't ever friends to begin with. And I find myself very much in that tension.
It's one reason I stopped playing bridge with my husband. I was in it for fun.
Well, and so, I mean, and so what if our approach to life and spirituality was, where's the fun here?
Yeah.
Instead of, oh God, somebody broke a rule. Again, the question is, what does God want from us? If God really only wants our obedience, God's got to be real disappointed. I just can't think that's what God only wants. I can't think about it.
Well, can I read for a moment, two readings we had, very short.
Please,
that-
please.
To get to that question a little bit, and they had us read, Romans. And in Romans 3, and it says there, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. And then they had us read 1 John 3. And let me just read more than I have written in my book here. The one who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. No one who is born of God will continue to sin, because God's seed remains in them. They cannot go on sinning, because they have been born of God. Now, what does that mean?
That means it's impossible.
Impossible to what?
to not sin, to meet God's expectations, to meet that person's
Well,
expectations.
it says that if we're of God, born of God, we don't sin.
Yeah, I think I read that too. So it's helpful to decode a little bit.
Yeah.
The word devil, diabolos, means slanderer.
Yes.
And slander is sinful from the beginning. Because it destroys proper relationships with other people, right? So if we could get rid of slander, I'm suspicious we would get rid of much of our shame.
But you know, walking with God and being in a personal loving relationship with God is not spectacular by any means. It just means that we listen more. You know, that we're responding to God's invitation to union. And so, you know, there's going to be ups and downs and all kinds of things, but the point is to stay focused on God. In other words, God, you know, I don't know what I'm doing. So would you please give me guidance? Or, you know, God, I thank you very much, because that worked out so well, you know. And so it's like you were working with a friend, you know, you thank them for what they have done with you or something like that. And, you know, because we can get caught up in all of these, you know, good things. I mean, we're talking about, it's very enlightening. But the main thing is you don't want to let that cut out that personal contact with God, because God is inviting us into a love relationship. And it takes developing just like any other relationship you have. You know, God has God's part, we have our part. But the thing is this, we love God. It's not that we know God, we love God and accept God's love of us. And that brings about changes in us.
You know, Herb, I'm wondering, do you know people? I'm putting you on the spot, but maybe this is for the group. Do you know of people who you tend to think of as being without sin?
I tend to think that they're without sin. When I know somebody, I think about that.
So do you
Oh,
know
that-
somebody
yes.
you think's a saint?
Well, yeah, I'm looking at everybody in the room as a saint.
What
No,
do you
I mean
think?
somebody without
To
sin.
me, a saint doesn't have sin.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
They do?
Yeah, they're human
Yeah.
beings. They made their mistakes, but the thing is this, you know, they grew
Well-
beyond them. And
When you're thinking biblical though, the biblical saints,
yeah, in
Yeah,
other words,
they're
they,
people.
I think of Mother Teresa.
Yeah, that came to mind to me.
You just wouldn't want her administering your morphine drip because you wouldn't get any. I just want you to know that.
yeah, she was tough.
She believed in suffering with the Lord, so
Uh-huh.
you weren't getting any palliative care from that lady. So you can be a saint in India, but I'll take Dr. Kevorkian at my bedside. Hey, I'm not saying that to burst the bubble. I'm saying, are there people you look at and you say like, you know, I want to be like you when I grow up? You have people you want to be like when you grow up.
Yeah, but that doesn't
mean without sin.
So I'm wondering that, coming back to that passage, if we start to get that out of the way, when we start to get the slander and the accusation out of the way, we start to see God's right there.
Yeah, it's a process.
Yeah.
So I'm able to take away sin when I start to not listen to that. Listen, my mother is not perfect. Is she sinless? Pretty much. Does she sin? Absolutely. Is she without sin? Pretty much. That's how I hear that reading.
Yeah.
Now you can accuse my mom of anything you want to, and I would call you the devil.
Yeah.
I'm being, you know, like, why not? I hope you don't hear me doing anything naughty with that. What if we lived our life oriented that way, where we could strip away the stuff that gets between us enough where we could say, Ellen, you're just really good like you are, you know? I mean,
She is.
I'm saying that authentically, because I
Yeah.
can, right? I mean, I would even tell you, like, I got there with JB Fox. When JB Fox, I'd say, hey, JB, and he'd say, damn. I miss that about him. You know, I do. I miss that about him because that's who he was. Like, I could say he should watch his mouth. He should be a happier guy, but he wasn't. Like, and he didn't. So why should I slander him when instead I could have a relationship with him?
Well, you know, in the early church, early Christianity, the people who sought Jesus were called saints. You read Paul and you'll find those letters in there. Didn't mean that they were perfect. It just meant that they were totally committed to Jesus or to God, and that they lived their lives accordingly. And your mother is very saintly because of who she is and how she lives. You don't have to be perfect. It means that you're on the right track, trying to walk the right path. You know, and the saints, a lot of those, God gave them really a lot of big gifts and stuff like that, you know. So, and we don't get those things. But the thing is this, we're walking a path towards sainthood ourselves. And it takes paying attention.
Maybe you all have already discussed this since I forgot to be here on time, but I had a lot of problems with this whole reading. And I was struggling with that concept of original sin, and I don't believe in it because God created Adam and Eve. I don't think we carry, I don't know, it's such a conflict for me. And your Romans reading, I was just like, no,
Yeah.
you can't be perfect without sin, was where my head was going.
Yeah.
Like, yes, sometimes I feel like I'm in really good relationship with someone, and sometimes I don't. So it's that in and out thing, and your comment helped a little bit with that, because I just found myself going, what? I don't agree with you through most of this whole reading.
Well, we're right with you.
It may be helpful to hear that there is no passage in the Bible that says be perfect as God is perfect. That is a misquote. It's be holy as God is holy, and holiness is about being set apart. And keep in mind that everybody in the Bible has got major problems. Everybody. Problems of doubt, problems of anger. So the testimony is God works with that. And we could say God puts up with it, or we could say, like, God doesn't even have to put up with it. God's okay with it.
God understands.
It's kind of like when you're making a pie crust, which a lot of people don't do these days. But you have that dough and you roll it out. And you're not going to have a perfectly round piece of dough. It isn't going to be perfect, but you're approaching perfect in a perfect pie. But you're not starting with perfect, because you can't make that so absolutely perfect. And
Yeah,
if it doesn't work out, you push it all together and do it again.
and the goal isn't even to make a perfect crust. It's just a good tasting pie.
Yeah.
Right. And so I don't care how it looks. If it tastes bad, I don't want it. And so, like, this is where we are.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes spiritually we do forget a lot of this, right? We could say I'm supposed to look a certain way. And look, I grew up in a church that was very much outwardly focused about what I was doing, how I was dressed, how I was talking. And I don't want to say those things aren't important, but they certainly aren't the most important things, are they? I mean, God, I hope not. And this is, I think, this is part of the reminder. I mean, I'll just tell you, and I've shared this from the pulpit before. My mentoring priest, one of my favorite moments with him, we were at the bishop was like sending on 3 people into retirement, and they had like a luncheon. And so there were like 40 of us there, and it was catered, and there was a hot buffet bar. And the bishop went to pray over the meal, and that's when Edward went up and filled his plate up. And I said, he was praying. He said, he's just a person. I'm hungry. And people could say, well, that's rude or whatever. I thought, I love you for that. I love you for that because, I mean, sure, it's social convention, but that's who he was. That's who he was. And if I changed that about him, he wouldn't have been Edward. And so I would never have changed it. And I just wonder if that text you read, Herb, isn't trying to invite us into like, a lot of it is like what we perceive. It's like, what if the biggest problem with humans is that we think there's something wrong with us? What if what's wrong with us is that we think there's something wrong with us?
Yeah. As we think, so we live.
Because look, we don't need to be everything. And the fact that we think we need to be everything, maybe that's the thing that's wrong with us. We don't have to be beautiful by everybody else's standards. But what you got is what you get, right? What if that's what's wrong with us, is that we're not grateful for what we got? Of course, we didn't earn or deserve it. I mean, you weren't righteous before you were born. You just were born here. I'm glad I was born here.
Yeah.
Here in America, that is, right?
Yeah, yes.
I don't mean there's wrong stuff in the world. I just mean, what if that's one of our biggest issues, is that we look at ourselves as fundamentally wrong or ashamed. I'll tell you, that's why I think fundamentalism is actually very powerful. Because if you're like me, you've had moments in your life where you think, I must be really effed up. Fundamentalism says you are. Yes, you are. And here's the fix. You pray this prayer and it'll fix you. It didn't work.
Yeah.
I really tried to believe it as hard as I could. It didn't work for me. Because I don't think it works. I don't think that's it. I think actually, like, the perfection is, it doesn't have to be perfect. We just get to be who we are. And thinking about other people is really important. And how my actions affect other people is really important. I don't always think about that. Sometimes I do it very well. And that's why we come back together, I think, to be reminded of that.
Yeah, I find in old age that all my life I've been driven. And now I'm having to, because of, now I'm having to say, okay, you don't have to do everything you did before. There are things that I get confused at times about, should I be doing something more, or am I supposed to just relax at this age or something like that? It's just something I think we all deal with, but the thing is this, we don't have to be perfect. We were all given gifts of particular kinds, and we've lived those and done them, and now we can rest. Because God, I think, is giving us that chance. And then, we're really on the last part of our journey to God. That's what old age is about to me. If you have the opportunity to live that long, look back over life and say, okay, I was wrong about that, and no, I wasn't wrong about that one, but I was right about that one. And you can begin to find some peace inside of you. But there are times when something goes wrong, and I say, well, there you go again, dum-dum, and that's really not right. But the simple reason the brain just doesn't work like it used to.
It's an interesting thing, right, to think about how bothered we get about being, and you said it and I heard it and I was like, oh yeah, how bothered we get about being wrong about something, instead of how relieved we could feel about having been wrong.
It is very freeing.
It is so freeing for me to think that two men can absolutely love each other. And I was wrong about that for 25 years. I'm so glad I was wrong.
Mhm.
I'm delighted that I was wrong about that. It's a different approach. The way I grew up is you should be ashamed that you were wrong about that. How could you not have known? Well, I just didn't know. And now I know, and I'm glad I was wrong.
Yeah, and because God made people that way. I mean, I'm sure that you can go back for different reasons, but and all this transgender part kind of thing, that's really mind blowing in a lot of ways, but yet God made them too, you know, and that I've met one or two and they're really nice.
You'll probably meet one or two who aren't nice, because that's just how
Yeah,
people
that's
fall,
just-
right?
yeah,
And
They're just like everybody else.
well, so, and I think that's, my dad said this interesting line when I was a kid. I still remember it. The minute you think you're different from everybody else is the minute you're just like everybody else. And I wonder, when you hear about Satan as the accuser, if that isn't wrapped up in that, right? The accusation is, I'm different. You're different.
Yeah,
Instead of, we've got common humanity, even if our gifts are different. Sometimes I wish I had the gifts you have. I think actually we would really benefit from a different approach. I do.
yeah. I
Yeah,
agree.
yeah.
Because the question is, once we recognize what sin is, the next question is, what do we do with it? What do we do? And I think, what you'll never hear me do, and I know it's in the prayer book, is the prayer of humble access. I won't pray it.
The prayer of what?
The prayer of humble access.
I don't know what that is.
Lord, we're not worthy to eat the crumbs that fall from your table. The reason I won't pray that in church is because after we've confessed our sin and been absolved, we are in fact worthy to eat right off the table.
Mhm.
And that prayer of humble access falls after the confession and absolution, so it takes you backward.
Mhm.
So actually, one year we did it during Lent, but I did it before the confession. We confessed, we were absolved, and then we were invited to stand and eat from the table. But this is what I mean about sometimes liturgy captures our feelings so well that sometimes we forget that they're not always true. I have feelings all the time that aren't true. I get angry over silly things, or I think, hey, my wife hates me today. But it isn't true. She's just agitated. I hope you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right? You can really have a feeling that is not based in truth at all. And liturgy is like that sometimes. And in that part of the liturgy, I think we've rested on our feelings away from the truth. So the truth is, like, get up. Get up, that worked. Well, maybe I didn't mean it enough, as if God needs you to mean it. God doesn't need you to mean anything for God to do what God's going to do. Well, I think that's what I think anyway.
I've even gotten to the point whereby when I come across those negative passages in scripture, I skip over them or I change them to the positive. Because to read them like that makes me feel bad, and I'm not trying to be that kind of person. I'm trying to be another kind of person.
Yeah. This is where I think it's helpful. It's good to remember, like, shame is a feeling that there's something wrong with you. Guilt is a feeling that you did something wrong. So guilt is really healthy. I made a bad decision and I'm strong and powerful enough to do it different next time. Guilt is real healthy. Shame, on the other hand, says, I did that bad thing because I'm bad and I'm just bad and I can't fix it. And that's a lot of Christian spirituality. I'm bad, I'm no good.
That's dangerous.
Well, I've lived there a long time. It's very dangerous. Yeah, it correlates really high with drug addiction, suicide, and depression.
Yeah.
Now, I know we haven't ironed out sin.
Well, none of these chapters have actually answered any of the
And
questions.
yeah, but it's-
They do invite you to think about it.
They
Yeah.
invite you to think about
Well, I'm grateful for your thinking out loud with me about it. And next week, we'll see Janie about grace.
it. Okay.
I'm curious.
Very good. Go ahead.